So today we're going to continue on with the PowerPoint. Try to get through an awful lot of it. We're gonna talk, or I'm going to talk pretty fast. Try to cover as much stuff as possible. So obviously, if you have questions, ask them. I'll ask you guys a few questions here and there, but again, we're really trying to cover a lot of ground. So we are going to move pretty quickly. Just a couple reminders. Your notebook check. Notebook check number 2 was due last night before midnight. If you have not gotten that in, please do so as soon as possible. If you can get in today, it's only 20 points off. Anything more than that, yeah, the grades get pretty bad. So please get that in. I'm going to be updating grades over the next few days. So, Tuesday, well, today's Tuesday. Wednesday, Thursday, I'll say at the latest, I should have all that stuff up to date. As far as things coming up, you still got the extra credit documentary review that's due on Friday before midnight. We are going to have our DBQ essay over kind of all this stuff, Unit 8, decolonization, Cold War type stuff. That is going to be due on, Monday, next Monday, before midnight, but I'm going to open it up at some point tomorrow, probably tomorrow after school. That gives you a decent amount of time to get it done. I would personally advise you do it sooner rather than later. But again, I do want you to have, an opportunity to wait till Monday if you so choose. That being said, next Friday is the end of the 6 weeks, which means, it's really important you turn this thing on time because there's not going to be a whole lot of time to get it in afterwards. That's pretty much it. There will be one more extra credit AP classroom quiz next week, but we're really getting to the tail end here, so do your best to raise your grades. If you're missing stuff, everything is still open. Do what you need to do to be successful. All right, so where we left off, things were coming to a head between Russia and the United States. Stalin had blockaded Berlin, which was a shared city. Sorry, I saw something. Which was shared theoretically, by the Allied countries from World War II. And the United States decided to, launch a massive airlift campaign to make sure that our people in West Berlin were doing all right. Stalin, takes his foot off the gas. He lifts the blockade. But again, that's the first of many provocations that you're going to see between the two superpowers. About the same time, 1949, Mao Zedong comes to power. He's the first leader of modern China. Okay, today, the People's Republic of China. That's only existed since 1949. And he's the guy that's kind of the father of communism there. So let's spend just a little bit talking about Mao Zedong's China. They are the second major communist power in world history. You're going to see a lot of similarities with Joseph Stalin. He's pretty ruthless as well. But most of the death, unfortunately, he calls, I think, is mainly due to poor planning, poor policy. Just because he's communist and Stalin's a communist doesn't mean they necessarily get along, doesn't mean that they necessarily do things exactly the same way. Every communist leader kind of puts their own brand on communism. You don't have kind of uniformity across the ideology, unfortunately. So when we left China last time, when we last really talked about China, the last Qing dynasty was on the downturn. It was getting overthrown. They got overthrown by a group called the Nationalists. They were the Nationalist Party of China, and they tried for many years to unify the nation. Never quite worked out. There were always people out in China that were kind of fighting for control of the country. Okay, you had the Nationalists. Eventually, you get a group of communists led by Mao Zedong. The communists and the Nationalists are fighting against each other. Then World War II hits, and they're getting invaded by Japan. So they've really got to focus on saving their country rather than fighting each other. But once the war was over, they could focus on that. They could focus on that animosity, and that's essentially what they did. Give me 2 seconds. I just had somebody show up to Teams. Anyway, so after World War II, the Nationalists and the Communists have no reason to get along, so they start fighting again. And ultimately, it's the Communists that win. Interesting note, what's left of the Nationalist Party, they go to the nearby island of Taiwan and they govern there. Okay? And it's really their descendants that run Taiwan still to this day. Kind of a contentious relationship. China still sees Taiwan as theirs, whereas Taiwan sees themselves as independent. Sometimes Taiwan comes up in the news because of that. Like I know a few years ago, and I forget what president wants. It may have been Trump, it may have been Obama, but we were negotiating with Taiwan. We were talking to Taiwan, recognizing them as a nation, and that's one of the main things that got China so ticked off. Our relationship with China, just like Russia to this day, kind of a strained relationship. And it all doesn't go back to the Cold War necessarily, but some of it certainly does. So 1949, long story short, China becomes the second communist country. They become the People's Republic of China. Sometimes people just call them Communist China. Some people call them Red China because red is kind of associated, that color, with communism. Mao Zedong becomes their first leader. You got to know this guy's name. You need to know that he is the father of modern China, but he's also the guy that kind of brought communism to China, much like Vladimir Lenin was the first communist leader of the new country of the Soviet Union. So what does Mao do when he takes over? He does kind of what most communists do. I mean, this is kind of the game plan. You saw it with the Soviet Union. You'll see it later with, North Korea and Cuba and some of the other communist countries that develop. They need to flip the status quo on its head. So typically what they do to try to enact this system that is trying to truly create a classless society is they change things. They seized land from the wealthy. They gave it to the peasants. They nationalized the industries in China. Essentially, they took over ownership of those industries. As in the Soviet Union, they created collective farms where peasants combine their land and work together to grow the food. Now that sounds all well and good if you are, poor and desperate and don't have any land of your own and don't have any way to really get a leg up. I mean, most of the people throughout China's history were peasants that didn't have a whole lot. But for those that were doing okay, for those that had their own businesses, for those that had some measure of wealth, I mean, this is going to be something that's going to make them very upset. Either way, with Mao's leadership, you either need to get with the program or get gone. Unfortunately, a lot of people get gone. 1958, Mao Zedong launched a program called the Great Leap Forward to speed up economic development. That's one you got to know. Got to know the Great Leap Forward. It's directly referenced in the curriculum guide. Much like Stalin's 5-year plans, this is meant to literally, update their economy. You got to remember, leading into the 20th century, China wasn't really all that industrialized. They weren't all that modernized. That's one of the reasons in the 1800s, those European countries could go in there and carve them up into their spheres of influence. He's trying to move away from that, okay? But they weren't really prepared to maybe, fully industrialize to the level that Stalin was. Either way, wasn't going to stop him from trying. The big thing, let's focus heavily on some industrial production, but let's focus heavily on food production. We'll make these huge collective farms. We'll be growing crops left and right. We'll have plenty for people to eat. We'll have plenty to export to other countries to make money for us all. And then we can focus more on building up the industrial aspect of our economy. Collective farms became huge communes of 25,000 people. These communes grew crops, ran small industries, and provided health care and education for their members. In less than 1 year, 900 million Chinese peasants were moved into these communes. That's a big logistical challenge, moving people around, getting them in these communities where they're going to take their directions directly from the government. Okay, very similar to the 5-year plans in that this is a planned economy, planned economic production. Quotas need to be met. Long-term goals are going to be worked towards. That's what the Great Leap Forward was all about. Unfortunately, things did not go as planned. The Great Leap Forward turns out to not be so great. In the beginning, Commune members were able to eat for free at the commune canteens. This changed when food production slowed to a halt. I mean, under communism, government's going to provide for your food. They're going to give you a place to live, because again, they want some measure of equality, ideally, and they want everybody working towards that common goal, the good of China, the good of the whole, not so much the good of the individual. So in the early days, yeah, things looked pretty good. They're providing for the people's needs. They weren't really set up right off the bat, with these large factories. That was going to take some time. So they had people making steel out in the countryside with like homemade setups to where they could focus on steel production. Fortunately, that still wasn't good. It was just like really bad stuff. So it was hard for them to use. It was hard for them to sell. Mao Zedong said, man, with this new method of agriculture, this collectivized agriculture.
If you are a test administrator, please do not stress about starting on time. We have a lot of students still looking for their testing rooms. We will make an announcement when we're ready to get started.
See, she sounded stressed, but whatever. God, she needs to turn down just a little bit. Anyway, Mao Zedong's, and they're using propaganda like everybody else. If we work together, our agricultural production is going to go through the roof. You got this big bale of grain just skyrocketing. You got this lady cutting down a melon that's bigger than her. We're all going to eat. We're all going to make money. Our country's got to prosper. You just got to stick to the plan, the government's plan. A lot of trust. Ultimate power has to be handed over to the government for any sort of communist system to even attempt to work. Unfortunately, it almost never does. In 1 year, the Great Leap Forward shattered China's economy. Poor agricultural production, droughts, and floods caused one of the worst famines in all of history. From 1958 to 1960, as many as 20 million people starved to death, while millions more died of disease. Needless to say, some in China's communist government began to question Mao's leadership. So, you looked at Stalin's 5-year plans, and there was some very similar stuff happening there. Stalin focused heavily on industry, and he did rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union, but the collectivized agriculture, for whatever reason, and part of it's just, nature. Sometimes nature doesn't cooperate, but it led to a lot of starvation. Did the same thing here, but Mao doesn't even immediately have the heavy industry to really point to and say, look at the success. Okay, they're getting there. They eventually do get there, but it took a lot of time. So Great Leap Forward, not so great. Some people start saying, hey, Mao, maybe he shouldn't be the leader. Well, Mao's kind of like Stalin. You don't question him. That's something that's not going to go at all unchecked. After the Great Leap Forward, many people in government began to call for reform. Mao feared that these people wanted to turn China into a capitalist country. So, in 1966, Chairman Mao launched a movement called the Cultural Revolution. Need to know that as well, which aimed to remove any and all opposition to the Communist Party. Very similar to Stalin's Great Purges, where he was just getting rid of anyone that might challenge his authority. Mao's two new supporters, the Red Guards, were given complete power to root out any threats to Chinese culture. The people were encouraged to betray each other to authorities for having anti-communist ideas. They sought out to punish those who criticized the government. They punished people who had contact with Western individuals or that seemed to have any sort of inclination towards Western ideas, such as capitalism. Hard to say exact numbers, but millions of people were violently persecuted, and thousands were murdered until 1971. China fell into chaos once again. The economy was weakened. The government was unable to carry out many of its duties. Again, this was a very repressive regime. Books being burned, teachers being, beaten up by their students that were members of the Red Guards. It was messed up, but again, it was trying to root out all that that non-communist influence. That being said, Mao was a master at the use of propaganda. You see all these posters, and some of them are kind of hilarious, but he actually had issued out to everyone in China a little book, a little red book. That's literally what it was called. It was a little red book that people were supposed to carry around with them, which when they found themselves in kind of troublesome situations, the little red book was basically what would Mao do. Okay, and it's full of like little bits of wisdom from Mao Zedong. And, a lot of people bought into that. Despite the fact that he's a bad guy, he's also the father of the nation. And much like Vladimir Lenin is still held in high esteem in Russia, and some hold Stalin in high esteem, Mao is still considered like their George Washington, even though he brought, all this death and destruction to them. To this day, you look in Tiananmen Square, there's a big picture of Mao Zedong. He is honored because in some ways he's a symbol of kind of the birth of modern China. I mean, without him, where would China be today? Now, things start to change after Mao dies. He dies in 1976. A guy named Deng Xiaoping takes over, and he starts to see early on, you know what? Communism ain't all it's cracked up to be. So he starts introducing a lot of economic reforms. And really, you look at China today, there's really only one political party that has any power. It's still the Communist Party, but their economic policies are a lot more like ours. They're more, I would say, socialist than anything. And that's the thing, even the countries that claim to be communist to this day, they've adapted over time for the most part. North Korea really hadn't, but most of them have, to where really they're communist in name, but their actual ideology of how they run economically, it's not like that anymore. I mean, in many ways, China is more capitalist than we are now. But their government and the power of their government, that is the carryover from the days of communism. And like I said, he is still seen as the father of the nation, even though he was responsible for the deaths of millions of his own people. Again, it goes to show you the power of propaganda. You talk well enough about people and you indoctrinate your young about the good stuff, not so much the bad, you can still see why some people would hold them in esteem. We used to do a lot more on China. This is kind of just a real brief overview, but definitely remember the little bit that we've talked about, because we'll bring China up again. So things are heating up. Now China's communist, and the Russians are kind of pushing their luck a little bit with us. So we decide, what, doggone it, we nod ourselves a good old-fashioned military alliance. The one we create is one that we are still in. It's still the main military alliance that we are part of, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, established in 1949. You do need to know what NATO is. And I'd write down a few of the countries, okay? And some of the membership has changed, obviously, since the very beginnings, but we're still in it. And unfortunately, and this was a big issue, when Trump came into office, he was really ticked off because he looked at the books. We pay for about 70% of NATO, even though it's an alliance theoretically that's going to benefit us all. Now, the argument could be made, well, we're the superpower here, especially back then. This was kind of our idea. Whether or not that's fair today, hey, that's debatable. But this was created just in case we had to fight the Soviets and essentially what would be World War III. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, we're in other organizations as well, but this is the big one. The United States, Belgium, Britain, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal. Once they, get rid of the communists, Greece and Turkey, West Germany, and Spain, much later on. So now there's a whole group of countries that have basically vowed to protect one another and said, hey, if Stalin gets up to no good, well, we will respond. So what do you think Stalin's going to do? Think about it. We got an alliance now. What's that? Oh, he ain't going to submit. This is Stalin. He don't submit. He's going to make his own alliance. Again, that's the thing with the Cold War. It's back and forth. We do something, they do something. They do something, we try to do it better. That is the ebb and flow over, about 40 years of history. So we've got NATO, his alliance, the Warsaw Pact. Now, it looks pretty impressive until you realize it's pretty much just the areas he was controlling anyway. Eastern Europe, aka the Eastern Bloc, the Communist Bloc, that's kind of a nickname, but I would know it. They established theirs, at least officially, a few years later in 1955 in Warsaw, Poland, hence the Warsaw Pact. They include, in response to NATO, the Soviet Union, Albania, who leaves eventually in the 60s because they stopped getting along with the Russians, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Eastern Germany. Whoa, sorry about that. Again, this is their alliance. And while I don't expect you to remember every name, just think it's the Soviet Union and all those areas in Eastern Europe that are on their side of the Iron Curtain. So it's not really as impressive of an alliance, really, because those are areas that everybody knew were puppets of the Soviets anyway. But still, y'all want to have an alliance? We're going to have an alliance too. So we're getting into the late 40s, the early 50s. Things are getting kind of rough. Okay? By 1949, this will be on another slide. The Soviets have themselves their own atomic bomb. So now is really when the Cold War starts to heat up. I mean, before the atomic bomb, before they had one, we had that distinct military advantage. We could put our hat on that. We are better than you guys. We have more stuff than you guys. But once we get to 49, especially getting into the 50s, not only do they have the same stuff as us, there for a little bit, they're starting to get better than us. Joseph Stalin dies in 1953. All right, so you would think things would get better, and they kind of did, because the guy that took over, Nikita Khrushchev, even though he was dictatorial, he's not Stalin. I mean, he came in, he criticized all the murders and all the craziness that Stalin participated in. And you're going to see the leaders, that follow are much more moderate, okay? I say they're dictators because they do have, to some extent, absolute power. They definitely are repressive. The people certainly don't have a lot of the freedoms that we do, but Stalin was the really bad guy. And you'll see people like Khrushchev, even though they're not necessarily good guys.
Good morning, Ranger Nation. Please
they move further away from that.
We need a couple things from you this morning. First off, friends, if any of you have power strips in your classroom that you wouldn't mind lending us, please put your name and your room number on them so we know where to return them to, and send them to the College and Career Center / Testing Center up here in the front office. That would be lovely. Teachers and testing rooms, we are still sorting kiddos, so please don't panic. Don't worry if you can't get started right away. We're good. Friends, y'all have a great day.
Anybody want to go on an adventure? I say that loosely. Does anybody want to walk down to the College and Career Center? There's some mule. If you would just drop this off, tell them it's from Mr. Michael Brown, not Cody Brown, or Reuben Brown, or whatever other Browns they have. I would appreciate that. Come on. Thanks, sir.
Oregon?
College and Career Center, it's next door to the nurse's office. All right, so Khrushchev takes over. Stalin is dead. He don't like America any more than Stalin did. He gives this speech, and this is a good one. And I want you to think about this. History is on our side. The whole narrative he's given is, hey, we're not the bad guys. The U.S. is. Think about why maybe I'm not going to say has a point, but maybe why some would buy into that. He says about the capitalist state, it doesn't depend on you whether we exist. If you don't like us, don't accept our invitations, and don't invite us to come see you. Whether you like it or not, history's on our side. We're going to bury you. Now that's confrontational, but think about America in the 1950s, in the 1960s. Anything messed up going on here? I think about America in the 1950s and 1960s compared to today. Were things equal for everyone? No. You still had racial segregation. You still had the very beginnings of the civil rights movement, where African Americans and others were just, fighting for equal opportunities, equal voting rights, things of that nature. You had women who were very much discounted, treated as if in some way they were less than men. You've got a feminist movement that's really going to start in the 1970s. I mean, people were not treated equally. That's a fact. Believe it or not, in the Soviet Union, they were. Women were treated much more as equal in communist countries. Minority groups were treated much more as equals in communist countries than you would see in the United States at the time. 1960s rolls around. Not only by that point are we involved or have been involved in some very controversial wars, but also, are there any noteworthy assassinations in the 1960s? One of our presidents gets killed. Anybody know who he is? Got killed right down the road, yeah. U.S. President John F. Kennedy, murdered. His little brother runs for president, murdered. Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights activist, murdered. Malcolm X, murdered. A lot of these prominent individuals who theoretically were trying to make things better, they get killed. And there's conspiracy theories as to who did it. Maybe the government's responsible. Who really knows? So Khrushchev, he's basically making the point that, hey, it's not like they're perfect. They're into some messed up stuff over there. We're going to be the better of this. We're going to win this. And at the time, even though today it looks kind of ludicrous, in 1956, they were winning, at least for a little while. A lot of what we think of when we think the Cold War is all about an arms race. Military buildup on each side. Cold War tensions increased in the United States when the USSR exploded its first atomic bomb in 1949. That's only 4 years after the United States does it for the first and second time in Japan to end World War II. Cold War tensions increased in the USSR when the U.S. exploded its first hydrogen bomb in 1952. This was 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Well, now, not only has this communist country caught up, but now they've actually gotten ahead. Only thing we can do is try to keep up with them. That's what kind of elevates this overall arms race into truly a nuclear arms race. I mean, if we have less powerful nukes than them, if we have less numerically than them, that's giving them the advantage, okay? Not only could they potentially win a war if there was one, but in the world stage, we were the superpower. Well, now it's looking like maybe they're the most powerful country. And if they're the most powerful country, now more people might buy into communism because it seems, at least for a little bit, to be working, although it really wasn't. This is why there has never been a World War III. And it comes down to the concept of mutually assured destruction. This is some vocab from the Notebook check. The military theory of nuclear deterrence holding that neither side will attack the other if both sides are guaranteed to be totally destroyed. It just kind of makes sense. Without nuclear weapons, at some point, we would have went to war with the Soviet Union. Okay, it would have happened. That's how high the tension was. I mean, it was inevitable. But when you have nuclear weapons, and us racing with them to keep about the same number and about the same stockpile of powerful weapons, you get to a certain point in our history that if there's a nuclear war and they launch a nuke, and then we launch a nuke, and then they launch another one, and we launch another one, our countries aren't going to survive. We're all going to die. Why even fight? The problem is they keep building up, we have to keep building up. Because if they get too far ahead, if they get too many more nukes than us, or too many more powerful nukes than us, well, then they could potentially win the war because maybe one bomb could do the job. So you have this military arms race that has to keep going, perpetually. Because if one side gets too much of an advantage, that's when MAD doesn't work anymore. That's when one side could destroy the other, which is a really crazy thing. For a while, it was just the United States and the Soviet Union that had nuclear weapons. Over the years, other countries have gained some as well. And this is old. This is like 3 years old. I think this is 2018. Yeah. At that time, and there's been some peace agreements, signed since then. We've reduced these numbers.
Good morning, Ranger Nation. I'm so sorry to interrupt your classes yet again. Online testing rooms. Let's just take a pause. Nobody be in a hurry, okay? We're working on getting you power strips, so just take a moment. You're fine. Everything is fine. If you're a paper
when you take your test this week, come with a charged laptop, because as you can see, it's going to be an issue if it's not.
If you are taking a test at all the rest of the week, please make sure that you bring a fully charged laptop. Friends, y'all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Anyway, look at this. Think about the fact that only a handful of countries today still have nuclear weapons. And also think about the fact that Russia and the United States have, exponentially more. Also think about the fact this is what we're reporting. Who really knows how many we have? Who really knows how many they have? Again, that's where some spying comes into it, but you got to keep on equal footing. And even though the Cold War is over, kind of, we still got beef with Russia. They got beef with us. All sorts of weird stuff is happening. It's getting into, cyber attacks and hacking and potential election manipulation stuff. Now it's not so much about the nukes anymore, but they're still there. Again, all this stuff that we're talking about, I know it was a long time ago, but there's a story as to why different groups don't get along. This is the story. Okay, this is how we get to the point that we're at today, where you've got the United States as a superpower, and really our only competition is Russia and China. Okay, a lot of that animosity, it's not all because of this, but some of it is. Now, here's the dark and scary thing. And is a concept, a term, I guess you could say, that you really do need to know: the military-industrial complex. Before Kennedy became president in 1960, and we're going to hop around in time a little bit because after this we're going to go back to 1950. But before Kennedy, became president, the president before him was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And the president before him was Harry Truman, the guy, from World War II. Eisenhower, you may recall, he's a military guy. He was the supreme Allied commander in Europe during World War II. Okay, he's a hero. He gave a speech, his last speech, and in it he gives a warning because he kind of sees what's happening. And it's a warning about the military-industrial complex. And I really want you to think about this. Here's what he said, and this is just an excerpt. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Guys, anytime there's a war, somebody's making money. Somebody's making a lot of money. So look at the Cold War. You've got a military arms race. Who's making all those bombs? Who's making those fighter planes and those helicopters? It's these private companies, and they're still around today. Lockheed, Halliburton, Boeing, Raytheon, Bell Helicopter, they're all part of this. Okay, and I'm not trying to say they're evil or anything, but you got to understand the Cold War goes on for 40 years. We've got to constantly be ready. That means these guys are churning out military supplies, weapons, vehicles, and they're making a lot of money off of it. What he's warning about is there are forces out there that want conflict, that need conflict, that need this animosity to take place. Otherwise, people are going to be out of jobs. Otherwise, these huge corporations aren't going to be making money. And that gives those corporations an awful lot of power. I mean, when people run for Congress or for president, some of them are independently wealthy. Most of them are wealthy. Let's get it straight. But campaigns take a lot of funding. Where do they get their funding? They get it through campaign donations. These are the sort of people that donate. Well, once somebody gets elected, now you kind of sort of owe them. So maybe, they put forth proposals for, hey, I've got this idea for for a new missile project. You know, we need some funding. Well, Congress is probably going to do that because they kind of owe these guys, and it just keeps going and going and going. That's what he warned about, okay? And you know, you look at it, it's pretty much been like that ever since. We've had to continue updating our military and building up our military and building up our stockpile of weapons, and during the Cold War, building up our nukes, maybe because of just, you know, keeping up with Russia, of course, but also these organizations got very, very powerful, not just economically, but in the government as well. So the military industrial complex, those are just all these companies that ultimately are going to benefit financially anytime the U.S. goes to war. And believe it or not, right after World War II, a war is coming. Our first proxy war, the Korean War. Technically, it wasn't a war because the United Nations did not approve it. So the United States called it a police action, but it was a war. 1950 to 1953, Korea is a weird situation. Okay, it still is to this day. South Korea, we're cool with. South Korea is kind of like us. They're a democracy. North Korea is a communist dictatorship, probably the closest to a pure communist dictatorship left in the world. At the start of this conflict, the leader of the South was this guy, Syngman Rhee. The leader of the North was Kim Il-sung. The current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il, that's his grandfather. Okay, after Kim Il-sung died, which they treat him like he's a god in North Korea to this day, power passed down to his son, Kim Jong-il, sorry. I always get the names confused. The grandson who's in charge now is Kim Jong-un. They have very similar names. Why did we go to war? Containment. So let's talk about how that all transpires. Similar to the division of Germany after World War II, the Korean Peninsula was divided between the Northern Territory held by the Soviet Union and the Southern Territory held by the United States. Korea was one of the many areas that had been conquered by Japan during the war, actually a little bit before the war. Well, once the Japanese go home, kind of like Germany, you know, it was kind of agreed, okay, Soviet Union, you know, the northern part of Korea is going to kind of be under your sphere of influence. The South is going to be over ours. It was all part of the negotiations, you know, after the war. So you've got a North that is kind of backed by the Soviet Union, who clearly embraces communism as an ideology. You got the South that is backed by us, who is going to embrace democracy. It's still like that to this day. Eventually, Kim Il-sung, again, I get the names mixed up, decides, you know what? To heck with this. There needs to just be one Korea. And he was probably, you know, encouraged by Stalin, who was still in charge at this point. He hadn't died yet. So North Korea invades South Korea, 1950. When communist North Korea invaded democratic South Korea, a UN Security Council resolution authorized the use of military force to defend South Korea, but not to actually make it a war. Again, that's why they called it a police action. I think the Soviet Union either vetoed or their delegate mysteriously wasn't there that day. It was kind of controversial, but we couldn't call it a war for a reason. Although forces in Korea came from 16 UN member countries in South Korea, of course, most of them were Americans, and they were commanded by U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, same guy that was in charge of the war in the Pacific in World War II. MacArthur was only authorized to push them back, not invade North Korea, push them back on their side and make sure they don't come back to the South. So MacArthur shows up here in the South near the city of Pusan and almost immediately overwhelms the North Koreans and pushes them back. Pushes them back across the border and then decides to keep on pushing. He pushes the North Koreans back all the way to the Yalu River, which is on the border of what country to the north? China, who is also a communist nation. So MacArthur kind of took it upon himself. No. We can take the war to North Korea. We're going to push them out. We're going to take it all. If the Chinese want some, we'll take them out too. Truman, the president at the time, doesn't want to instigate, what could be World War III, because if China gets involved, then the Russians are going to get involved, and it's just going to be a mess. So he tells MacArthur to stand down, but MacArthur goes out in the press because he's a really popular guy. He was thinking about running for president probably the next time around, maybe him instead of Eisenhower, who knows? And he goes out in the press and basically just makes Truman look like a fool, okay? MacArthur wanted to nuke China. I mean, that's the level he was taking it to. Truman fires him, okay? He leaves the military in disgrace, and as soon as MacArthur's gone, the American forces get back on their side of the line. Now, the war rages on for quite a while, 3 years. But at the end, the old borders pretty much stay in place. No real land was gained. The Soviet Union did not send in any troops, but they did send money and weapons to North Korea. Communist China, an ally of the Soviet Union and North Korea, did send troops, but their fighting was pretty much limited. Once we got away from their border, the fighting was done. That's as close as we've ever been to war with China. Okay, there were some skirmishes, there was some fighting, but it wrapped up quick enough to where there was no formal declaration of war, and pretty much as soon as we were away from their territory, the Chinese started to back off. After 3 years of fighting and some 4 million civilian and military casualties, the war ended in a stalemate. To this day, the two parts of Korea remain divided, with a demilitarized zone, the DMZ, in between. Although this conflict was not directly fought between the US and the USSR, it is considered to be the first proxy war or surrogate war between the superpowers. The war ends in a ceasefire. It's never formally kind of wrapped up with a peace treaty. So technically, North Korea and the United States are still at war. Now, we haven't fought each other ever since, but it's one of those deals. They hate us. Okay, the kids there are indoctrinated to believe that we are the evil empire. We're the ones that invaded their country. We're the American imperialists. And because their media is heavily censored, and even though stuff bleeds in, because today with the internet it's hard to keep all of it out, they're probably the most isolated people on earth. Their leader tells them they're the most prosperous people on earth, yet people are starving to death. The only way they eat is through foreign donations. Okay, people donate food to North Korea to this day, whereas their leader lives in mansions and flies around on jets, and it's just a really messed up situation. North Korea is by far the weirdest place on earth. If you ever have a chance to watch a documentary, maybe like the one that's due on Friday, that would be something pretty darn interesting to get into. We're going to stop there. After this, we're going to get into the space race, which follows shortly after the Korean War. Again, us going to space, us going to the moon, all that, it was just to try to outdo the Russians. Because again, we couldn't let the perception be out there that they were ahead of us scientifically. Guys, it's during the 50s that the U.S. government, stresses in education the importance of math and science. Okay, like today, math and science get a lot of the funding. They're the ones that are oftentimes the most formally pushed. And the reason is, that's kind of when this initiative went into place. So tomorrow we'll get into the space race. We'll get into Cuba becoming communist, which causes all sorts of crazy stuff, like the time we secretly invaded Cuba during the Bay of Pigs invasion. Also, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when they actually had nuclear weapons there. It would have been a bad deal. We'll also get into the Vietnam War, another proxy war, much longer war than the Korean War. And once we get through that, that's the last big thing. We should be able to wrap it all up on Friday. Thursday, you're going to be off doing testing. I'm going to be working with the online kids, but what we're going to do is the same stuff you're going to do on Friday. So there's nothing to make up. And then on Monday, you do have a DBQ base on this, but honestly, you could write a DBQ now, just what we've covered. If you want to wait till we're completely done, that's fine. But if you want to start early, that's fine too. One thing you might want to consider, after STAR testing, I mean, you'll probably go to what? Probably 7th and 8th period at least. I doubt you'll be doing much. And maybe you can write your DBQ while you're in those classes. I mean, if you have extra time, you will be shorted a little bit. You won't get the full hour, but if you're willing to write it in 50 minutes instead of 60, hopefully you can have some time to do it at school. That way it doesn't have to be homework. But again, I leave that up to you. The DBQ will be open at some point tomorrow, probably right after school. So just kind of keep that in mind.